So I'm very excited to be hosting tonight's event and to welcome Liza Mundy back to Politics and Prose for the launch of her brilliant new book, The Sisterhood. I've been hearing Liza talk about this book for a couple of years, and she's always very humble and self-effacing, you know, not really working on anything that big of a deal. And then I got the book over the weekend and sat down with it, and it is really masterful and propulsive from the very first page. I guess it should be no surprise that it's also a deeply researched, very narrative and a timely story of women at the CIA that spans 7 decades. Kirkus, in a starred review, called it another winner from Mundy, who tells a story that deserves to be told about women who deserve to be remembered. Liza Mundy is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author of 4 books, including Code Girls, and she is a staff writer at The Washington Post and writes for The Atlantic, Politico, and Smithsonian, among other publications. And she will be in conversation tonight with Shapira, who's been a staff writer at The Washington Post since 2000 and was on the Post team that won a 2008 Pulitzer for coverage of the Virginia Tech mass shootings. He's written extensively about the lives of CIA operatives, and he's at work on a novel, which I can't wait to read. So please help me welcome Liza Mundy and Shapira.
Thanks for coming out. I'm glad we got a big crowd tonight. I see some familiar faces, including my family is somewhere around here. And maybe we might have some journalists and former or current spies. So welcome. My name is Ian. Liza. Liza and I used to work together at the Washington Post. Liza, you may not remember this, but I remember this one moment we had together. You may recall there was some crashers at the White House, and Liza and I actually drive out to Fauquier County, Virginia, to look around. And
of course, I remember.
Remember
this.
that? Okay,
yeah,
we were like driving
in the middle of the night. Like those were the days.
Yeah,
when
those
that
were the
was
days.
A Washington
Yeah, exactly.
scandal.
So yeah, this is a different kind of story, different kind of scandal. This is a different kind of story. I've written a lot about the CIA for the Washington Post, and I've written a lot about women at the CIA, actually, and many of them who died in the line of duty. But this book, to me and to my mind, there's been so many books written about the CIA, many of them memoirs by men, especially, and many just straight up books by journalists or other authors. But I would say, and for those of you in the crowd who are steeped in CIA literature, I will say this unequivocally, that The Sisterhood, Liza's book, is up there with Ghost Wars and The Legacy of Ashes. And so you really should buy this book. It's a terrific book, and it's so propulsive. And you will find so many great stories that are both inspiring but also troubling as well. So we'll get right to it, okay? And one thing I will also say is that I won't be surprised if Hollywood is calling you already. There's like 1 million different movies in this book. So that's something you should look out for too. Any discussion of the CIA kind of begins with the OSS, and we'll spend a little time on the OSS, but the OSS was created in the early 1940s, and there were 2 men chiefly at the head of the OSS. And when I was reading your book, I was struck by how both the CIA kind of touts these men as historic, legendary figures at the agency, but according to Liza's book, they were not the greatest people also as well. They were a bit misogynistic, and maybe I'm underselling that. I mean, William Donovan, for instance, there's a statue of him inside the lobby of the headquarters. But when I was reading your book, you had this great sentence. He was a man of panache, charisma, activity, and grandiose gestures. He was also a snob and a sociopathic womanizer. And then there was Allen Dulles as well. Allen Dulles was the brother of the Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles really shocked me. He was well known for for handling a German asset, a man close to Hitler who was actually trying to conspire to kill him. And it turns out that Dulles actually wasn't the person handling this asset. It was a woman. Her name was Mary Bancroft. And you had this another great line. I'm just going to speak for you real quickly. Alan Dulles, a serial adulterer, was, like his boss, William Donovan, sexually unfaithful to an almost pathological degree. I think you said he had 100 affairs. So
that's what his sister estimated.
So anyway, my question, that's my long build-up.
In the New York Times.
Yes. So my question, that was my build-up to my first question, which was that the original DNA of the CIA was rooted in these two men and the tactics they used to hire and rely on women. And I wanted you to talk about some of the findings that you came up with, and how, you know, these women, Donovan called them the invisible apron strings of the OSS. And I just wanted you to talk about these two men and the kind of tone they set that would then reverberate down the line.
Yeah, so it was a complex environment, and the Sisterhood is in some ways an outgrowth or a successor volume to Code Girls, my book about women code breakers during World War II. When I was writing Code Girls, I knew that there was a parallel cohort of women who were recruited to the OSS, the predecessor agency to the CIA, when we were terribly surprised at Pearl Harbor and had to build up our intelligence establishment right away. And one of my favorite documents that I ran across when I was researching the creation of the OSS and the recruitment of women to staff this spy service, because of course the men are signing up to fight when we enter World War II, and we've got to scale up right away. And there was the OSS had to figure out, well, how do you test people to be spies, you know, to work overseas? It's one thing to get someone who comes from a good family or went to an Ivy League college or is smart or is resourceful, but how do you tell how they're going to be able to cope in occupied France or in China or somewhere in the world when things are going to go wrong? And how do you know how the personality of a person is going to unfold over time? So the OSS set up training camps in around Northern Virginia at first to test the men who signed up for the OSS who were recruited, and they had to figure out how do you tell who's going to be a leader, who is going to be trustworthy, who are other people going to trust, who's going to be able to hold his liquor, who's going to be able to just tolerate snafus and frustration. And so the men would be given these tests. You're standing at a brook in Leesburg, and you're to imagine that it's a rushing river, and you've got a machine gun, and you've got to carry it over this chasm, and you're being pursued by the Gestapo, and then they would observe these teams of recruits to see how they were imagining themselves in this scenario, and they would see who could figure out what you could do with a couple of planks, you know, to get them across the rushing river, and who did the other people trust, who did they not trust, who could hold up under pressure, who could hold their liquor at the end of the day when other people were getting drunk. And so that was the test for the men. And the OSS knew, like all the other agencies in Washington, but particularly spy agencies, William Donovan, when he was building the OSS, went to England to see how the British built their spy service. And after one meeting with his colleagues there, he wrote the word women on a legal tablet and circled it. And so he knew that he was going to need women to help build an American spy service. But then how do you evaluate women? And so the women who were recruited into the OSS were, more than half of them had been to college at a time when only 4% of American women had graduated from a four-year college. So they were very well educated. Many of them worked in the private sector when that was unusual. They made high salaries. So they were very well qualified women. And when they were brought in for their anonymous testing, they were assigned to file papers and to come up with a filing system that would allow for the storage of documents and the retrieval of documents. And so they had to come up with a good system, but they were also being tested deliberately by psychologists, some of whom were female and had observed how things were going, tested for their ability to tolerate being underestimated and underused and having their skills being given work that wasn't worthy of their talents and their skills and their education, because these psychologists had seen that that's what was going to happen to them in the OSS, and they had to be able to put up with it, because the idea was that women were going to be sent, women would work in Washington, but women would also be sent overseas. They would do the filing, the writing up of 3x5 cards, because we have to remember that an intelligence agency needs all the information that gets collected has to be filed. It really does have to be filed, and it has to be kept, and it has to be cross-referenced. And if somebody knows somebody else, you have to figure out that relationship. And so that's what they expected the women would do. And so they wanted to see how well they could do it, but also how they could put up with being given work that they felt was beneath their abilities. And then what happened, I mean, war is an accelerant. And so the women were sent overseas, and the ones who were gifted and resilient and able to put up with things very quickly moved up in the ranks and were contributing in significant ways, including Mary Bancroft, who was actually recruited. She was living in Switzerland. She was recruited by Allen Dulles, who was stationed in Switzerland. And she became basically his right-hand woman, just as you say, handling a German asset who was conspiring to assassinate Hitler and providing the OSS with just an enormous bank of intelligence. And Mary Bancroft was simultaneously sort of, she was a confidant for Dulles, and she was a confidant for the German asset, two lonely men in very isolated positions in a foreign place. And the only thing that, if you've heard of her, the only thing you've known for is ultimately Allen Dulles successfully seduced her. And so people know the phrase he says to her gaily, well, the work will cover the romance and the romance will cover the work. And that's what people think of her as. But she was writing reports. She was eliciting information. She was helping draft his reports back to Washington, were really what cemented Allen Dulles's reputation. And both of these guys were having affairs, certainly right and left. And that was not even considered remarkable. And of course, because these are clandestine settings and assignments and it's wartime, there are plenty of opportunities. And there's some suggestion that at least one of his liaisons with Mary Bancroft was really not that voluntary on her part. He wanted to clear his head before a meeting. And so he just came in and said, quick. And so it was that kind of a environment from the get-go, in that women were needed, women were necessary, women were recruited, and the guys knew that. But they were also exploited and taken advantage of, and they proved their abilities, and in many cases, they really loved the work.
Yeah, and I think you had also written that Mary he paid her nothing.
He said, because you're you, we'll pay you at the lowest salary level. Like, how many women haven't heard that at some point?
We're going to skip forward a little bit in time to another favorite chapter of mine in agency history, which is the hunt for Aldrich Ames. This has been written about, obviously, to some degree, but what I liked about Liza's book was that it was an incredibly clear and lucid and detailed distillation of how that went down. And I wanted to ask you, for those in the audience who may not know, Aldrich Ames was the worst traitor in agency history. He gave up the names of Russian assets and who were then killed because of that. He was secretly working for the Russians the whole time. And so it fell to three women who found out who he was. These are women who, in one case, I mean, I know for sure that she was carpooling with a guy for a while. Sandy Grimes. But what's interesting about the book is that you reveal what happened afterwards. And what happened was that these women there were three of them principally, and then and a fourth person as well. But it's worth mentioning their names: Jean Vertefeuille, Sandy Grimes, and Diane Worthen, along with another man named Paul Redman. And when he was caught, there was an awards ceremony. You talk about this awards, the various awards that were given out, and I'll let you handle that. But that was really troubling to me, actually.
Right. This trio of women are also a great example, because they were routinely throughout their careers given jobs that were beneath their abilities. I mean, they were all called amazing college graduates who signed on with the CIA, wanting to be spies, wanting to be case officers. Jean Vertifoy, who was hired, I forget exactly what year, but it was like early in the 60s. And she wanted to be a case officer. She wanted to be a spy handling assets. And she was she was just given sort of the lowest level clerks and secretarial work, but she was compiling names of, I think, Soviet scientists or sort of something on that level. But as she was doing it, she was memorizing it all. Her memory and her knowledge, her biographical knowledge of all of these assets and people that the agency was building biographical information on, she committed it to memory, and she just had this laser intelligence. And so, her career advanced, but it advanced at such, she had to wait so long for her step increases or being promoted to another grade. She would go to one station and find that women there could only go up to a GS8. So she would jump to a different station because women inexplicably could go to a GS9, at some stations, but it was always grades below the men. And but she was just what they were looking for in 1942 as well, because she stuck with it, and she went from station to station, and she became this incredible memory bank. And the other two women had similar experiences, so like they had been around. And when Aldrich Ames was coming up as a mediocre case officer, and case officers, as probably most people know, are the CIA officers who do go overseas for the clandestine service covertly and recruit foreign nationals to basically commit treason and hand over secrets. He was a legacy hire, which was also very common. It was, kept in, his father had been with the CIA. And so Aldrich Ames was, although his behavior in terms of drinking and having affairs and basically not being very good at what he did, and bringing women to safe houses, and there was something you could be called a geographic bachelor that was just accepted when you were married, but you were stationed by yourself. Your wife didn't come along. His wife didn't come along. His ex-wife, ultimately, because she was an analyst and she had a good job back at headquarters and was more, was a better officer than he was. And so he had a girlfriend, and that was just not considered unusual. So his behavior was basically kind of accepted. I mean, it was seen as over the top. He got really drunk at Christmas parties, and people like, yeah, but it was just not seen as unusual. But these women started, they were looking at him from a different vantage point than the old boys who accepted him as a legacy. And so they persisted, as Elizabeth Warren said, and they identified him, and they were so patient going through all these financial records and trying to create this chronological document and match up times that money had been put into his bank account, and he had a meeting, say, with
there's also the matter of the window treatments.
Oh yeah, and then they noticed that he was buying, that he and Rosario were buying window treatments.
A non-trader CIA officer would just get
we get them room by room.
Exactly.
Yeah. A journalist as well.
Exactly.
But they were getting them for their whole house, and they're like, and so little things like that. And so ultimately, it took years, and it took interference by the FBI, which slowed things down, looking at another target. But finally, when Aldrich Ames was identified as a traitor who had given away the identities, first of all, Jean Vertifoy was hauled up before an intelligence committee in Congress and asked, well, why did it take so long? And what made you think that you could, that you were qualified to do this kind of work? So she was hauled up and really called to task for having taken so long. And then when the awards were handed out, I don't have instant recall, but
it's their boss, Paul Redmond, got a medal. Vertifoy got a less prestigious award. Sandy Grimes received a still lesser one. And both Grimes and Vertifoy boycotted the ceremony in protest. Yeah. My other favorite moment, and I say that facetiously, from this episode was when Rick Ames realizes that Sandy has been put onto the counterintelligence team, and The day Sandy Grimes started in the counterintelligence center, Ames approached and asked her about her new assignment. When she told him, Rick immediately began a lecture on the most basic tenets of a counterintelligence operation. He mansplained to the female investigators how to conduct an investigation. Which I thought, it doesn't get any more classic than that.
No.
I mean,
Yeah.
that made me shake my head.
And it, just as you say, it also shows how embedded they were. I mean, that they were carpooling together. He was able to wander over to their desks and try to look at what was on their desks.
Yes, he's still alive, by the way. He's in prison. Yeah, and that's interesting for another story. I'm going to fast forward to the hunt for UBL, Bin Laden, and this is this doesn't start, right before 9/11, and obviously that's obvious to anyone who's worked in the agency who's in this building right now. But I don't know if it's obvious to maybe the average person, and I think that's what was so great about this. And what's even more interesting is that it was women who were targeting him right away. And I want to start by talking about a woman named Gina Bennett. And she, to me, was one of the most fascinating people in the book because she was a UVA grad, a CIA reject, and she was then assigned to the State Department as a typist.
She had to wear a skirt.
Yeah. And
this was in the late 80s.
Yeah. And she is realizing with the Soviet withdrawal, after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, that there are factions of, tribal factions that are all being dispersed and are all forming. And she is realizing there is a humongous flow of foreign fighters, not just in Afghanistan, but in Chechnya and other countries as well. And this is on her radar, right? And I think, and then there was another friend of hers, Cindy Storer, as well, who was
tracking that,
who was tracking this as well. And to me, one of the defining moments of this book is when Gina writes a memo in August of 1993, and I have it with me here. But it's in 1993, and the name Bin Laden, and I checked this in advance of this, but the name Bin Laden did not really appear that much at all in the press. I mean, at that time, in 1993, his name appeared maybe a handful of times, a couple times in The Guardian, once in Long Island Newsday, and that's about it. Not a lot, but there were women in the intelligence community who were onto him, and she wrote this cool memo that got declassified in like 2007 called "The Wandering Mujahideen, Armed and Dangerous." And on page 2 of that memo, she writes, "Among private donors to the new generation, Osama bin Laden is particularly famous for his religious zeal and financial interests." And she goes on to talk about him. So I wanted you to talk about the question I had for you, which was about Gina Bennett and Cindy Storer, was just when you talk to Gina and Cindy for this book, how do they look back on those moments in early 1993? His name was not a household name. They have to feel a certain bit of pride in that they were onto him, but also regret that what obviously did not happen. So I wanted you to talk about what it was like to talk about these women and hear them recall these moments from the early 90s when none of us in this room, not a lot of people in this room at least, were thinking about Osama bin Laden.
Right, yeah. And Gina is, to me, also characteristic because she was particularly galvanized when she was hired at the State Department. She was rejected from the CIA. She was hired as a typist by the State Department. And she remembers that she was typing along for an exit interview, and the personnel officer said, "You don't belong here." And she thought that she was being fired. And the personnel officer said, no, you're better than this job of just typing and transcribing what goes on in meetings. And so she was promoted to the terrorism watch desk at the State Department. And several months after she was put on the terrorism watch desk, basically receiving cables from overseas about any sort of terrorist event. And this was in the late 1980s, when there had been a lot of plane hijackings around the Middle East that many of us may remember. I do, and other kinds of hijackings. So terrorism before the terrorism of 9/11 and that period in the late 1990s, the Lockerbie bombing occurred. And Gina was, just about a year out of UVA, and there were civilians killed in that bombing. The Flight 103, the bombing over Scotland, and there were civilians and there were students from Syracuse University. And so she was really galvanized by the death of families, the death of civilians, the death of children, the death of students just younger than she was. And so that was really, and this was these actual hijackings and bombings of the 1980s were galvanizing for a number of the women in my book, who decided, another woman who's a thread throughout, Heidi August, who was with the clandestine service, was also present in Malta for a terrible, terrible plane hijacking. And these were the women who made a pivot early on from the Cold War anti-communism struggle to started paying attention to terrorism as it was rising in the Middle East and becoming more prevalent. And I don't know whether you would attribute it to gender or not, but they were just particularly traumatized by the deaths of families and children and civilians. And that was what I think got Gina hooked on trying to take this issue on and trying to call attention to it. And so, I mean, she was remarkably young, I think just in her late 20s when she wrote The Wandering Mujahideen. And so when she looks back at that now, she says, a lot of my colleagues thought I was going out on a limb. And I think I kind of was. Like, I'm not sure I would have been bold enough to write that now. And I think as a journalist, like, you can look back at stuff, you're like, thinking, God, what was I thinking? Yeah. And so she's sort of like that now, like, wow, I was really bold in my assessment, but it was what I was seeing. And so women like Gina and Cindy, who was hired to the CIA in about the same time in the 1980s, I really identified with this cohort because I was coming into journalism at the same time. And you think the playing field is level because you've maybe been to a coeducational college that hadn't been coeducational for that long. You think, okay, well, the battles have been won. And then you got to enter the workforce and try to make your voice known and try to make your interest, if you're a journalist, you got to try to convince your editors, if you have slightly different interests than they do, that these interests are valid. And it's hard. And so for these young women who were in their late 20s, maybe 30, they were coming into the time when the struggle against this communism was where you were supposed to be. If you were the CIA, if you were an analyst, you wanted to be in the Office of Soviet Analysis. And so that's where the top jobs were that was harder to penetrate. So they found their way into counterterrorism at a time when the field was a little more open because it wasn't prestigious, but also because they were really engaged with the work. And once again, like Jean Verdefoy, and like the women hired in the OSS, they really were willing and able to dig into the records. I mean, the stereotype about women, particularly these agencies, is, well, women are diligent and women are patient and they'll just, sit there and sift through data. And I think, like many women, I'm not really sure that I agree with that or how I feel about it, but these teams did do that. And what Gina and Cindy began doing was just, again, building this minute, detailed awareness, particularly with terrorists who are, individuals all over the world, communicating with each other, like, who's talking to whom, and who, how many times are they talking, and where have I seen this name before, and what do I know about this bomb maker that they're talking to? So the wordy answer to your question of, when they look back at it now, Gina kind of marvels at the audacity of her younger self to write this memo, going out on a limb, talking about Osama bin Laden at a time. And I mean, she just nailed it. And then these are women now who've been through pre 9/11, 9/11, the 9/11 Commission report, where they're called out for being failure to connect the dots, not being compelling. Like they remember a meeting where it was read to them what they were going to be criticized for and called out for. And then, you know, the Iraq war. And so when you say, you know, like when they look back at this time, they're looking back at it now through so many layers of frustration and I would hope satisfaction, but they just really having dealt with the feeling of failure and being called out for failure.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so anger?
Anger, yeah. I mean, I one of the themes I think throughout the book was just that they were onto something. They were ringing the alarm bells and then nothing happened. And I was thinking a lot about that in the late 1990s when a lot of these women were working in the what was, and I think initially called the Bin Laden Issues Unit,
right.
and then then the name was changed to famously called Alex Station, which was the unit within the counter-terrorist center that was tracking Bin Laden in the 90s, and that's where these women wound up working for. And they had multiple chances to kill or capture Bin Laden. In the late 1990s, I think they counted 10 times they had him. I mean, they had him in Kandahar, at a compound in Kandahar.
Not the women themselves, but
not the women, no, but they had tracked him there, and they had been begging.
Women had tracked him.
They were begging George Tenet to make a strike, and I think that it came back that he didn't want to do it because he didn't want to kill women and children. Actually,
I know it was struggling with the fact that the terrorists would travel with women and children, using them as human shields.
Yeah,
and some of the women at Alex Station were like, "You got to take him out. Yeah. He's declared war. We're at war," and it took a long time for. I mean, it was a struggle, and you can understand why it would have been a struggle. It's very difficult to know what to do, but a number of the women were very frustrated.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, that was just the 9/11 material in the book is just heartbreaking to read. I mean, you really see and even after, I mean, there were these, I think Tenet created these red cell teams. You talked about that, where these were groups of men, largely white men, right, who were allowed to
been on the Office of Soviet Analysis and didn't have anything to do.
Yeah, and they were free to write speculative reports that weren't grounded in fact.
Right, or to come in and say, "Okay, ladies, you all were the B team, and so we're gonna, we're gonna show you, we're gonna write these speculative reports, the view from Bin Laden's cave."
Yeah, I want to talk about two more women before we open up to questions. There were two women in Alex Station that were tracking Bin Laden pretty chiefly. One was Alfreda Bukowski and Jennifer Matthews. To me, Jennifer Matthews, the story of Jennifer Matthews is quite heartbreaking. If you've seen the movie Zero Dark 30, she was kind of portrayed in that movie as the base chief of Coast when a triple agent or a double agent, however you want to define it, comes into the base. And Jennifer allows him to come on the base without needing to be checked, and they basically they tell the security guys to not check him. And he comes on the base and he pushes a button, and the suicide vest explodes and kills 9 people, a total of 9 people. 7 of them worked for the CIA, and then 1 was an Afghan driver, and the 9th person was a Jordanian intelligence officer. I will plug another Washington Post book by Joby Warwick, Triple Agent, which gets into all that in far greater detail. But the aftermath of this was very hard on Jennifer and her family, and I wanted you to briefly to talk about, here we have a woman who was in charge of this day, was bringing on an asset that she'd been hunting Bin Laden from the start, and she was essentially killed by Bin Laden because this guy was not the person they thought that Jennifer thought he was. And I just wanted you to talk a bit about the aftermath, the recriminations, the criticisms that were leveled upon her, despite the fact that many men were also involved in this. But it somehow, GQ magazine is the one that says she was in over her head and everything else.
Yeah. So that's all true. And Jennifer Matthews was a pioneer of what was called targeting, which was a new kind of skill that the CIA was developing to, again, find terrorists wherever they were in the world, wherever they had dispersed after 9/11 or after we invaded Afghanistan. And it was just, I mean, they were just remarkably skilled at doing this. And she was one of the early recruits to Alex Station. Bin Laden had been on her radar screen for just about as long as he had been on Gina Bennett's. And so, just as you say, after 9/11, she continued, and there was the tragic an incident where after her death, she and this is, an old trick in the agency's book, was blamed for an operation gone wrong. And for example, she had presented the agent with a birthday cake because his birthday had been recent, and people were like, oh my God, what a girly thing to do, to give him a birthday cake. Imagine that. It seems so silly, but in fact, small gifts of food, or one of the case officers that I interviewed, she said, I flew out from Dulles with a box of Georgetown cupcakes on my lap one time because a source in Nigeria had seen them on the Food Network. And like, anything you can do to butter people up. She said there was a guy in my station who was always taking candy from our station's bowl of candy that had been flown in from the States to butter up, just small things like that. So that was very characteristic, actually, of something that someone would do. And the phrase that you would hear to describe Jennifer Matthews or some of the other women in Alex Station was, well, they just worked in their office. They were just sneakers. They were wearing sneakers. They just worked in their office in tennis shoes, was actually a quote. And that is, I mean, within the agency, that goes back to these women who were recruited during World War II. They were called vault women to keep the records. And women literally who were keeping the classified records at the CIA would wear tennis shoes because they were on their feet all day, and it distinguished them sort of from the professional corps who were required to wear heels. And so to call somebody a woman in sneakers or a woman in tennis shoes was a slur that the workforce would have understood, that she didn't know, she had not been in the field, and she didn't know what she was doing. Now, I should say that some of the women I interviewed who were in the clandestine service did feel that the targeters, who were analysts and had started out in desk work, perhaps weren't given the operational training, the full operational training that they should have been given before being sent out to these dangerous bases and stations in very dangerous places. And if in fact that's the case, obviously the fault would lie with the institution and not with Jennifer Matthews herself.
Yeah, I just remember it seemed like it was a thread that everyone was trying to sort of get right, was being fair to her, but also wanting to understand, well, did she get the training she deserved? And a lot of people didn't think she did. The last person I want to talk about, and then we will open up to questions, but very quickly, I thought we should give a shout out to Molly Chambers, who there's a dotted line between Jennifer and Molly, because Molly was a 22-year-old at the headquarters that day, was tasked with tracking down a widow from the bombing. And but Molly goes on, I don't know Molly, but Molly goes on to be kind of a superhero to some degree. She winds up going to Nigeria, where she winds up penetrating Boko Haram, who had just kidnapped 276 female students. And she has a source, and the source tells her where the head of Boko Haram goes to church, right? And there was, and then she quickly contacted the people at headquarters, the National Geospatial people, to get a map of what church looks like stairs.
Yeah.
And anyway, you can just briefly talk about that person.
Yes, and it's possible that she's here. Some of the women in my book are here, and thank you. And I do, because I do want to convey the wonderful personalities of so many of the women that I interviewed, and particularly, well, I wouldn't say particularly. I mean, Molly represents a long line of women with clandestine service who are in the book, who were overseas as spies, and who did the work in part because they loved it so much. And I think Molly would say that it was the best thing that she ever did, and it was the hardest thing that she ever did. So she was, and she also represents a generation of women who signed on with this kind of work in the wake of 9/11. She was a teenager, a young teenager, when 9/11 happened. The way she looked at it was 19 men changed the course of the world that she would grow up in. And so she was at UC Davis, just sort of hanging out in a sorority. Her grades hadn't been great, but a very gregarious, very smart, likable, game sort of person. And she was working, I think she was working at a job fair, and she got to know an FBI recruiter. And one day she got a call in her sorority house from someone who said they were with the CIA. And of course, she thought it was a prank that was being played on her. And her first interview, and she just played along. And she later found out that her first interview was what they call the tinfoil hat interview, you know, where they're just trying to see if you're a sane person or not. And then she ended up, but because of 9/11, I think, you know, so many of us in the room, I'm sure, remember that. And we also remember how galvanized people were after 9/11 to join the fight against terrorism, to join the effort. And certainly that's true of Molly. And so she was an intern. She left, in order to do a 6-month internship with the CIA in college, she had to work a summer, but she needed 6 months of continual internship. And so she took a semester off of her senior year at college, and her sorority mates thought she'd left to like secretly have a baby. And she couldn't even tell them when she came back, you know, why she was, where she had been. And then as soon as she graduated, she went into training, but she was on the desk when she was assigned to find housing for the widow of one of the male officers who had been killed at Coast. So she was just in her very early 20s, just as fresh a newcomer, wearing JCPenney loafers, you know, on her very small salary, you know, as fresh a newcomer as you could be. She said, you know, she remembered the memorial service in the bubble at the agency, and she was like, I'm going to a funeral at work. Like she said it was so bad I didn't even understand how bad it was. And then so she proceeds to become a case officer, serving in several different African stations in this post 9/11 environment where all of these terrorist groups exist now, you know, Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, that are basically franchises of Al-Qaeda. And she is one of those who is out trying to combat now what's become a very dispersed terrorist movement. And she's also, as the women in my book who were doing case officer work in the 60s and 70s, she's also in Africa, where you can work a lot of hard targets. You can find North Koreans who are in Africa, or you know, people from other countries, not just from Africa. So she's about half of her work is against hard targets, and then half is counterterrorism. And just as you say, and there were so many reasons why Molly is a central character toward the end of the book, because she does represent this, what you might call a third generation. And she had hilarious stories of like having to get naked massages while she was, you know, with this spa that was being run by North Koreans. They thought it was money laundering. And so her anecdotes were very good, but her motivations were very much representative of the post 9/11 era, but also counterterrorism was a very controversial time in the history of the CIA. I mean, there have been many controversial eras, but the reaction to 9/11, the secret prisons, the enhanced interrogation, the drone attacks. I mean, this is a very, very difficult time and very controversial time. And I wanted readers to understand that among the kinds of manhunting or person hunting that the agency became very good at, there were these humanitarian efforts to help the youngest and most vulnerable victims of terrorism, like the schoolgirls, like the Chibok girls in Nigeria, that Molly was helping to find and helping to reunite with their families. So, you know, not to sugarcoat what was going on during the counterterrorism period, but to remind readers who might know about some aspects of it, but not others, that there were efforts like this going on as well.
Totally.
in very dangerous places.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most sensitive reporting that you did for this book involved particularly one woman who was involved in, who was present at least for some of the waterboarding that took place, and you get into that. You wind up tracking her down and interviewing her, thanks to the help of a great fact checker, I believe, who might be is here. Anyway, I want to open it up to questions. So the way this works is that you've got to get to the microphone, and I guess the only thing we ask is that keep the questions tidy and try not to monologue. Just ask the question and we'll get to it. That way we can get to a lot of people, okay?
Hi, thank you. This is a really fascinating talk. I wonder, I was wondering if the CIA has retained sort of the Ivy League old boys club nature, or has it changed somewhat?
I think it's changed. One of the things that I also tried to illustrate in the book is there have always been networks of CIA officers who looked out for each other. And so it was important to be part of a network from the get-go. And the Ivy League, the old boys, was one network. I mean, it was certainly true that officers were recruited from Harvard or Yale or from Brown. And one of the women in my book who was recruited in 1966 was recruited out of Brown, but wouldn't automatically be part of the old boys network. There was also a Greek American network. There were also geographic networks if you worked in Africa Division or Latin America Division. And so what the women had to do over the years was to clandestinely build their own network. And it was very difficult, and it took a long time. You couldn't be seen as a feminist. You couldn't be seen as a rabble rouser. So they had to do it clandestinely. And so I would certainly say that that the agency has changed. I mean, it's changed in so many ways. There were many, many years, decades, where you couldn't be gay or lesbian and be in the agency. And now, you know, there are diversity groups, and you're not going to be hammered in your polygraph on whether on who's, well, you might be hammered on who you sleep with, but they're not going to be looking for same sex, you know, to eliminate your blackball you based on same sex relationships. And so that in and of itself is a big change, and the presence of women is a big change. And again, you know, Molly being recruited out of her sorority at UC Davis, I think would be much more typical. And she said, you know, when they came for their opening class, they were told, like, don't think you're such hot shots. Don't think you're so great. You all are the people who showed up. You know, like, we recruited a lot of people. Y'all are the ones who showed up. So she's like, okay, yeah, I was one of the ones who showed up.
So I loved Code Girls and really look forward to reading your new book. But I was a little disappointed in the Crypto Cafe.
Oh, at Arlington Hall?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
Would they have named a restaurant for the men if there'd been a large group of men working on code breaking that possibly saved us 2 years of war in World War II?
Yeah. So what she's talking about is in Code Girls, my last book about these 10,000 women who came to Washington to break German and Japanese codes. Some of them worked at a place called Arlington Hall, which is in Arlington, Virginia, which is where the State Department has its Foreign Service Training Institute. So all of our diplomats will pass through there, and there is a restaurant there now, or cafe, that is named the Codebreaker Cafe, and I think it has some very beautiful murals now of depicting the women. There were certainly men who worked there as well, and so it's not like called the Women's Codebreaker Cafe. But your point is well taken, and I certainly would like to see there be a more significant public tribute to 10,000 women who, right. You really want their names on the outside of buildings, not on the inside of buildings. But hey, it's a start.
Hi. My name's Tim Weiner. I've been reporting and writing about CIA for a while now. And I ecstatically blurbed The Sisterhood. If you have not bought it, you must.
Thank you.
It's a great book. It's one of the best books about the CIA and also about the political culture of this town, as everybody calls it. I want to ask Liza to help me solve a question, a problem. I'm now writing a book, reporting a book on the CIA in the 21st century. And there came a time just over 5 years ago when a woman named Gina Haspel became the director of the CIA. Very talented, very tough clandestine service officer. And in short order, not only the #1 job at CIA, but the #2 and the #3 jobs at the CIA were filled with women. There's not an agency, a cabinet level office, or any place in Washington that's ever been run by 3 women. Leaving aside Gina's controversial past, do you think that altered the chemistry of the CIA? Do you think it made a difference?
I don't, because I don't know, because I don't think that it lasted. I mean, it was something that happened when she was there, but it didn't remain true. But I interviewed female clandestine officers who had mixed feelings about the fact that Gina Haspel had, I think, women heading at some point, like every directorate, I think maybe had a woman in charge. And people saw that as, yes, I mean, it's progress. But some people invoked, say, Paul Redmond, who was heading up the hunt for the Aldrich James, for the traitor identified as Aldrich James, who had this team of women who had his back, who were diving in, who were doing all the records, Jean Verdefoy and the others. And so this tradition of a man who has a team of women who's making him look good in meetings. And Gina Bennett and others said so many times some guy would say to me, come with me to the meeting as the briefer because you'll make me look good in the meeting. And Mike Schroyer also, who put together Alex Station and had all these female targeters, he would give them a lot of free rein in the meetings, and they would make him look good in a meeting. And so this was like a known thing, that there would be a very successful male officer who had a bank of women who had his back. And what some of the women said about Gina Haspel was, okay, well, where were the men who had her back? Like, the fact that she had all of these women installed at the top of the directorates didn't necessarily feel like progress, because they wanted to see that there were male officers who had her back. Like, they had not seen that there would be a woman who had a team of men who were like, you go, girl. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it was a watershed moment to have all those women in charge, but whether or not it permanently changed the culture, you're going to have to tell us that. I look forward to it.
When we were little kids at Princeton, no gray hair, nothing. Did you think at that point, were the seeds of telling stories of women who were unsung, did that enter your mind at all?
I don't know. Thank you for this. We're classmates, class of '82 at Princeton. You know my colors, but that's.
I see it.
And okay. So I have this. This is going to sound very trivial, but when we were there in the late '70s, early '80s, one of my memories coming from Southwestern Virginia to what was still a male-dominated campus was I thought it would be really fun to be the voice of the band at football games. So the Princeton had a very fun, irreverent band that would put these sketches on during halftime of football games, and there was always an announcer. And I thought it'd be really fun to be the one who got to write the sketches and read them aloud while the band was cavorting on the football field. And so I auditioned, and I made it to be, I think it was me against one other person, and they chose the other person, and they came up and said to me, you were really good, but we couldn't imagine a woman's voice coming out of the speakers at the football stadium. And I was like, okay. But so like so little memories like that, like, oh, your voice, it seems unfamiliar. I mean, there had never been a woman announcer. And so that, to me, like, that is sort of a metaphor of, trying to get your voice heard, like literally trying to get your voice heard. And so I certainly wanted to be a writer when we were there. I don't know that I would have envisioned telling these kinds of stories. But it just sort of unfolded. I mean, what's kind of funny to be writing a book of history that's regarded as history, is a lot of the book, like, I remember. It was my life, and so to be writing, say, about the 90s in Washington when these women at Alex Station were establishing themselves and trying to get their voices heard. I mean, literally trying to get their voices heard. There was so much going on in Washington. You know, there was the Monica Lewinsky scandal. There was Bob Packwood. There was Anita Hill. Janet Reno was the first female attorney general. I mean, and I remember being a journalist at the Washington Post. I remember writing about that stuff. And in part, that's why I ended up writing these books, because it was such a confusing time. There was just so much turmoil and trying to figure it out. Like, what is okay? And we're still processing that. So no, not at the time, but it all sort of did.
I think there was a little seed.
Okay.
In there.
I feel
If
like
you say so.
Liza, you may not be telling us about the time that you were recruited at Princeton for the CIA. I'm kidding about that.
Never. It was a recession. Nobody was being recruited for anything.
Fair enough.
The answer to this question, maybe read the book. But I'd like to take you back to the 70s when Schlesinger was at CIA, and he kind of did his purge of like 10% of the entire staff. Was the gut of that women? Was that one of the reasons?
No, I don't recall that was seen as gender. I mean, in fact, I would imagine it was probably more male because it was mostly the clandestine service, I think. And so I would imagine that the reports officers, because in the 1970s, the clandestine service, most of the spies on the street were men, and then the women in the clandestine service were usually reports officers who were at the desk rewriting their cables and writing it up into reports that would go to Washington. So I don't know for sure, but my guess would be that men were more likely to have gotten the job.
Thanks.
But yeah.
We'll take one more question. One more question.
Hi, was James Angleton involved in any of the controversies that you're involved in?
I really didn't. I didn't really sort of go there in writing about Angleton. Yeah.
Liza, thank you so much. This
Thank
is
you.
awesome.
Yeah.
Great to see you.
Thank you for coming.
Good luck writing the screenplay for the many multi Hollywood movies, but congratulations.
Thank you.